So it's the Jeremy Vine Show. We continue by a little bit more talking about a date, an extraordinary sort of moment in our history, and we're going to hear all about it. Tomorrow sees the 50th anniversary of the last two men to be executed in the UK. No one knew at the time that they would be, but that's what we're going to talk about, because by the 1960s, support for abolishing the death penalty had been growing in the UK. The case of Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be executed in Britain, caught the public's imagination. Here's how the Pathé News Service reported that story in 1955.
On June the 21st, Ruth Ellis was found guilty of murder at the Old Bailey and sentenced to death in accordance with the law. On July the 13th, she was executed in accordance with the law. But Britain's conscience was uneasy. During those 3 weeks, while public controversy mounted, one man had a terrible decision to make, Home Secretary William Lloyd George. As he went about his public duties, he had to decide whether or not to write the grim words, "The law must take its course." But in the end, he had no choice. As the law stands, and as precedent dictates, Ruth Ellis had to die. For the hundreds who waited at Holloway Jail on execution morning, and for the millions who stayed away, three questions remain. Should a woman hang? Should anyone hang at all? Or should there be degrees of murder? Millions are asking, is it civilized to kill by law? Does it really act as a deterrent? Is it right to ask any human being to carry out the killing? And if the law says that it is, should it be set aside merely because the murderer is a woman?
So some of those arguments we will be hearing on the radio today in just a few minutes. That was 1955. And after that, it was 10 years later, in 1965, that the penalty was suspended. It was a trial, a suspension. Then, in 1969, there was an overwhelming vote in the House of Commons, and that's when it was abolished. So, we need now to go back to these two men I was telling you about. It's August the 13th, 1964, and Gwyn Evans and Peter Allen were both hanged for the murder of John West. And at the time, there was little public outcry. Their execution went largely unnoticed. We will debate the rights and wrongs of capital punishment. You can join in, and you know how. But let's hear about this history from an author who's written extensively on the history of executions in the UK. He's Steve Fielding, and he's in Blackburn. Hello, Steve.
Good afternoon.
What crime did these two men commit?
They were actually convicted of murder during the course of theft. The death penalty was only applied for certain crimes after 1957, so this was one of the few crimes that carried the death penalty.
And who was the man they killed, and how did it come about?
They were two out-of-work Preston dairymen. They were both petty criminals who'd just been fined for stealing a car, and they needed some money. They needed £10 for the fines, they had a rate demand, and they had some back rent they owed. Gwyn Evans knew a man who lived up in Workington who said he would lend him money. So on the night of April the 6th, they stole a car, took Alan's wife and children, and drove up to Cumbria. They went to the house, Evans went inside, asked the man for some money, and then the murder took place.
They stabbed him?
They stabbed him and they coshed him at the head, yeah.
For £10?
Well, they wanted £100, but he said he would lend them the money with certain conditions, that Evans would have to go to bed with him. Alan then burst into the house, stabbed him and coshed him, and they stole some bank books and some watches.
Now, that happened, and how soon after that was the whole trial and was the whole execution? What was the space of time betwixt crime and hanging?
Well, between the crime and the arrest, there was about 2 days, because Evans had left his jacket in the house with his belongings in, so that he was very easily traced. They were tried on the 7th of July, which is about 3 months after the murder, and they were hanged about 5 weeks later.
So the whole thing was done and dusted from murder to execution within 4 months?
Within 4 months, yeah.
Now, what was the method used, and how quick was their death?
They would be hanged. The executions in England were always carried out by hanging, and by 1964 it was a very refined science, so the whole thing would take about 10-15 seconds from the hangman entering the cell, strapping the convict's arms behind his back, and leading him into the execution chamber, which was situated directly next door to the condemned cell. So he would simply just take about 12 paces onto the trapdoors. The hangman would put a cotton bag over his head and adjust the rope, while the assistant fastened a belt around his legs, stepped back, pulled the lever, and the man's dead.
And was there in the UK a last meal?
They were offered a breakfast. Some people would eat it, some people couldn't face any food. But it wasn't like in America where they could order in fried chicken and things. They just were given the prison breakfast, bacon and eggs.
And the executions were carried out at 8 in the morning of these two men. And how quickly were they dead after 8?
They would be dead within seconds. I mean, death was normally pronounced 10 minutes later, but by all accounts, they were dead from once the rope had tightened around the neck, because they were killed by dislocation of the neck rather than strangulation. So it was all very quick.
And I mentioned they now have a place in history. What is that place in history? And did they know it at the time? Did onlookers know it at the time?
Nobody knew at the time, because the death penalty was carried out very infrequently in the 1960s. There was 2 or 3 the year before, 3 or 4 the year before that. So in 1964, there were just the 2 executions. I think the reason they became the last people is the Labour Party came into power with a manifesto that they were going to abolish the death penalty. So when they came into power in October 64, so following that time, any death sentences passed were normally respited. So the last death sentence was passed in September 65, and then they did the abolition then.
So it was never carried out, it was a sentence never carried out?
No, the last ones were carried out in August 64, yeah.
So you wrote a book, you looked into all of this, and I'm going to debate the arguments. When abolition came in 69, what was the mood in the House of Commons? What was the vote like, and what was the moment in history like?
I think by the time we got to 1969, we'd been through the sort of swinging 60s, and we had the Summer of Love and everything. I think the general consensus was that hanging had its day, so I think the vote was quite clear, to abolish it.
Steve Fielding, thank you very much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much.
He's the author, and he's joined us from Blackburn. Well, let's welcome here in the studio with me a man who's glad about the abolition. He's from Amnesty International, which campaigns worldwide to stop capital punishment in other countries now. Is Steve Crawshaw. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
And I'm going to greet you again, but I'm going to fade your microphone up. Good. Hello.
Hello, pleased to be
and,
here.
And a man who would bring it back is the columnist for the Mail on Sunday, Peter Hitchens. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
When you hear the story that's just been recounted, do you say to yourself, number 1, good, and number 2, bring it back?
Well, it's not a matter of good. It was a necessary thing, and it's necessary now. We still have a death penalty as well. We never got rid of it. It's just now carried out by police officers with guns, without due process, without possibility of appeal or reprieve.
But in your opinion, yeah.
No, absolutely. That's what happens. That the state still kills people, but it doesn't do them with any it with any kind of legal due process or any possibility of it being prevented by the law.
Well, would you bring it back as a?
I would prefer us, if we're going to have a death penalty, and all societies do have death penalties, because the law will ultimately use force and lethal force in all countries and all cultures. I would want it to be done with due process, with a jury trial, presumption of innocence, a free press covering the trial, the possibility of appeal and reprieve, whereas at the moment it's just bang. And I think it must be preferable, mustn't it, surely, to have it done legally.
I just want to get it as clear as possible, because I believe you've witnessed an execution in the United States. And
2.
Could you tell us what you saw, and do you want that to come to the United Kingdom? Could you answer those 2 things?
No, I've seen 2 executions in the United States, one by lethal injection in Texas and one by electrocution in Georgia. I wouldn't want either method to be used here. I think the method which we used of hanging by and of instantaneous snapping of the spinal cord is much more humane than either of those methods. I would be very much afraid, for instance, with electrocution, we still have no way of knowing whether the executed person suffers considerable pain or how long the process takes. And lethal injection, apart from all its other many disadvantages, looks far too much like a medical procedure to me.
And Peter, were you, as a human, upset?
Oh, immensely. I when asked at the time how it had affected me by a colleague, my instant reaction without thinking was I felt considerably older, and that's after the electrocution. The lethal injection is a different matter. Right. I was rather puzzled by more than anything else by that, because I wasn't quite clear what had happened. But it is a horrible thing, but the thing is that you have to remember it's intended to be horrible.
Steve, do you consider this state murder, however it is carried out?
Yes, it clearly is. I mean, there are many practical reasons which we can come to as well, but the idea that because some horrible crime has happened, that therefore the state is itself entitled to commit killing is an extraordinary idea. And it's interesting to hear Peter say, I mean, in terms of killing that may happen on the street by police officers or others, Clearly that's wrong. We all know that that's wrong, and there need to be investigations if that has happened in the wrong circumstances. It's an entirely different issue from the due process. He rightly says there should be due process, but there should not end up with state killing at the end of it.
And in the case of severe crimes, if God forbid that you ever heard about something close to you, do you think you'd still have that view? If something happened to someone you loved, do you think you'd still be able to come on the radio and say, no, we must never kill people?
I absolutely hope so, and I feel reasonably confident. I mean, to put your question slightly differently, do I understand how people feel such enormous grief and anger that they feel in this particular thing that revenge is needed? That I can see how humanly people get to that position. But the idea that a state or a government thinking about these things, that this is good for society, if whenever that happens, therefore we will also kill, that's completely wrong for many, many different reasons.
What kind of club would we join in the UK if we brought back some kind of clearly judicial process ending in capital punishment? What would the country that you live in be like, in your opinion?
Well, I would like to think that is beyond hypothetical, which is great. There are people arguing for it, but in fact, the arguments have got less and less over the years. The people have understood it. It doesn't make sense. I mean, to answer your question directly, who is top of that list is China. We have North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and, of course, the world's largest democracy, the United States, which lives, if you like, in a, I would argue, pretty dangerous and inhumane bubble of its own on this issue. But the majority come from places which have no connection with democracy of any kind.
Peter, you don't, I imagine, want us to join that club, really, do you?
It's not a matter of joining a club. It's a matter of recognising that we used to do something sensible, which we've stopped doing. You let Mr. Crawshaw get away with claiming that the arguments against the death penalty are overwhelming. I don't know what he hasn't been asked to actually provide them. What is it that he objects to?
Well,
it's perfectly obvious that the state, which is after all the exerciser of justice, is going to have to occasionally use its lethal force to exercise and enforce justice.
Let me get him to answer your question.
I mean, what is actually his principled objection to the state killing people who have done wrong?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. I mean, yes, indeed, I was waiting for my opportunity and I'm happy to come in. Lethal force, you say it's obvious the state should be able to use lethal force. I think it's less obvious than anyone could possibly imagine. Just as they shouldn't be using it on the street, so they shouldn't be using it in the more decorous surroundings of the prison yard. Or
but inevitably,
like it's inhumane. I'll just finish through if I may. You asked my response, and I will finish through.
Answering the question.
I will finish through since you asked me those things. So on the one hand, you have the inhumane, and it's recognised. The UN, for example, has called for a moratorium on the use of the death penalty because of that inhumanity, which is broadly understood, apart from in places like China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so on. We also have, which we haven't addressed yet, a very, very important practical issue.
We also have,
if I may say,
uninterrupted run. I asked you a question. You're now taking advantage of it to not answer my question. We maintain, for instance, armed forces to defend ourselves in the event of attack, which are licensed to kill. And many things which they do, I disapprove of. And for instance, we took part in the bombing of Belgrade during the Kosovo episode, in which, amongst other people, the make-up lady at Yugoslav television was killed. I objected very strongly to that, but large numbers of nice liberal Amnesty International supporting Guardian readers thought it was fine because they still believe that the Kosovo war was fine. Many Guardian reading liberals supported the Iraq war, though they pretend they didn't at the time, and they also licensed at that time the use of lethal force by the state. Unless you're an absolute pacifist who believes that there should never be any use of force by the state at all, you have a problem with this.
Okay.
And there is that simple. But the other simple point is this: that the deterrence argument remains immensely strong.
Right. Okay. So two things.
I need to make a point here because it's
can you make it briefly? Otherwise, we'll have to cancel Steve Wright.
Because we have so much better medical services than we had in 1965, that huge numbers of people now are very, very badly injured by people who used lethal force against them, but who survive. And if we still had the medical services of 1965, we would have a homicide rate equivalent to that of the United States.
So, Steve, I want you to tackle two of Peter's points there. One, the state already uses lethal force, and two, just calm down. It's deterring people.
Okay, there's actually three things. On the one hand, using lethal force, military conflict is obviously quite different. We all want not to have wars, but it's quite different from the state killing people on an individual basis for crimes. On deterrence, a key point, you raised something, the statistics and the studies are actually very clear that they are not clear. In other words, a series of studies, both by the UN and in the US also, has said we see absolutely no clear evidence, and we're going to dull detail on this, but those who try to say there is evidence of deterrence are absolutely wrong. And the key thing, which we haven't yet addressed, is the fact that we have a complete irreversibility. The death sentence doesn't allow for mistakes, and that's wrong.
We don't really need to address that, because I think we all understand once someone's dead, they're not coming back. But we do want to thank you both, and I know you'd like it to go on. I'm sorry if you haven't got enough time, but I think we got the sense of it from you, Steve Crawshaw from Amnesty International, and to you, Peter Hitchens, in our Oxford studio. Thank you very much indeed for giving us the benefit of your view too.